welcome everyone, and just like to say well done on taking the time out today to look after yourselves. This session is very much just acknowledging the array really of potential work-related stresses that many of us are experiencing and could be experiencing at the moment. And I was really keen to discuss and explain a bit more of some of the terminology used with regards to some of the literature on work-related stresses and distresses, because primarily there's quite a lot of research come out of COVID and care workers' experiences during the COVID pandemic. And I think that we tend to maybe minimize some of our really difficult experiences at work for a whole host of reasons. It can be really difficult to acknowledge that we're struggling with workload or circumstance or a whole host of things. So I hope that this session gives you a bit more of an understanding and potentially some insight into what might be impacting you on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's no denying that work-related stress is on the rise. The figures here from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development found in 2020, so I mean I imagine this is even greater now, that over 2/5 of public sector organisations were reporting that stress-related absences had increased over the last 12 months. And out of that survey, it was recognised that people were saying that the most common cause of work-related stress in public sector was the heavy workload. And of that cohort, 70% stated that it's the most common cause of long-term absence in that sector, which is quite incredible, really. You know, that's quite a lot of absences due to the stress that we're experiencing at work. And then in 2020 also, the labour force survey found that rates of work-related ill health, specifically due to stress in the health sector, statistically is significantly higher than that for workers across all other industries from the HSE. So, you know, there's no doubt that there is a lot of work-related stress out there. So in terms of what we might notice in terms of work-related stress, in looking at how this might present in teams. So, you know, as I go through the slides, you might want to be reflecting on whether you'd noticed any of this increasing more in the teams you're working in. But this can present as things like more disagreements in teams, arguments, higher staff turnover, people being more overt and reporting their experience of stress, more sickness absent, a reduction in work performance, more complaints and grievances. And ultimately, if all of that is going on in any of the teams that we're working in, then unsurprisingly, there is the potential for an impact on the delivery of the quality of care. But, you know, that's not going to be of any surprise, is it? And then from a more individualized perspective, thinking about the actual signs of stress in an employee, you know, things like arriving later for work as motivation decreases, taking more time off, being more twitchy or nervous, experiencing mood swings, being a lot more withdrawn, loss of motivation, commitment, which is likely to result in a loss of confidence and a greater range of increased emotional reactions. So if any of the things on this slide or the preceding slide are something that you've felt or maybe observed, then it's really worth reflecting on what might be going on, what's going on for yourself as an employer, depending as an employee, sorry, and then depending on your role within the team, the organisation, what might be going on for members of your team. So as I said, what I really wanted to do is, just in the context of work-related stress, drill down and have more of a focus on the different types of work stress and distress that are becoming more frequently cited and consequently researched. So I'm going to start with moral distress, because the research around moral distress has really ballooned post-COVID. Just because of the experiences that many public sector staff went through as a result of the pandemic. I mean, it's probably worth noting that moral distress originally comes, a lot of the research and a lot of the literature around this comes from the veteran field. So it's something that usually we would be expecting soldiers and the armed forces to experience, but you know, it's much broader in terms of its remit. So when we talk about moral distress, we're actually referring to this sense of psychological unease that is generated when professionals identify an ethically correct action to take. So, you know, most of us in our day-to-day work know the standard of care that we want to deliver. But moral distress happens when there are constraints in our ability to take that action as we want to. So, you know, this might be for a whole host of reasons. And at the core, moral distress really is a situational problem, often due to the circumstances an individual finds themselves in. And hypothetically, theoretically, addressing moral distress should be quite straightforward, because actually all it really involves is tackling some of the situational stimuli. So, you know, the circumstances which are preventing individuals perhaps from taking the ethical action they want to. So put more simply, it's this sense of feeling of unease that stems from situations where institutionally required behaviour does not align with moral principles, and this is perhaps as a result of a lack of power or agency or structural limitations. And I think this very much the latter is what happens when you know, we might have insufficient staff, resources, training or time, and we know what we need to be doing. We know what we want to be doing, what we've been trained to be doing, but unfortunately we just don't have these structures to allow us to do that. And that starts to increasingly feel very, very uneasy. So the individual who's actually experiencing moral distress might not even be the one who has acted or failed to act as well. And I think, again, this is very relevant in healthcare settings. Moral distress can be caused by witnessing moral transgressions by others. So from a health and social care perspective, if any of us are in an experience situation where we see that those we work with also perhaps aren't able to act in a way that they want to and that is most ethically appropriate, just witnessing that can also lead to this moral distress. So what happens if we continue to be exposed to situations that cause moral distress? Well, this can go on to actually become what we refer to as moral injury. And this is where sustained moral distress actually leads to, you know, a more impaired function or longer term psychological harm as a result of continually having this internal conflict, really, where our moral principles, our values are being challenged. And moral injury can produce really, very profound experiences of guilt and shame, and in some cases also cause a sense of betrayal or anger or profound moral disorientation. And unsurprisingly, there is an increasing body of evidence now suggesting that moral injury can be correlated to some severe mental health issues developing. So, this is a really significant issue within the health and social care sectors, and increasingly a whole other range of sectors. So I want to talk a little bit about related terms as well, because as I say, there's a whole host of definitions for the range of work distress that we tend to experience these days. So I just wanted to highlight that moral distress and moral injury are actually distinct from burnout. So experiencing a lot of moral distress could lead to burnout, but burnout in and of itself actually describes the physical and emotional exhaustion that we experience when we have low job satisfaction, or when we feel very powerless, or when we're very overwhelmed at work. And although obviously there's a lot of crossover there and the terms are related, the thing that burnout doesn't usually have, which moral injury and distress does, is this moral component. So you can be burnt out from work and this the exhaustion that you may experience, even if you're always able to do the most moral thing. So the moral distress is very much that moral component, and as I said on the previous slide, moral injury has been linked to a whole host of other conditions, including compassion fatigue, which I've put empathy distress in brackets. I'll go on to explain that in a moment. Burnout, depression, PTSD, and in worst case scenarios, even suicide. At present, neither moral distress or injury are regarded as forms of mental illness, specifically though, which is also worth noting. So not only when I started the presentation, the research was from 2020, so that pretty much coincides with the start of COVID, but actually then came COVID and the subsequent periods of lockdown and a huge demand on the public sector. And so unsurprisingly, research considering the experience specifically of mental health care healthcare workers in the NHS during COVID has concluded that actually many of them suffered from moral injury. So these are the individuals working specifically in mental health in the NHS, and it's unsurprising really, because this was due to their perceived failure in being able to provide the quality of care that patients required. And at the time I was working in a community mental health team, and with lockdown and feeling that moral obligation to want to go out and be with people who were in a great deal of mental distress and not being able to, it really did leave a lot of my colleagues and myself feeling as though we had really let patients down. So again, I would really encourage people to just reflect on, have they even had time to process, or experience or reflect on how you managed during COVID and what impact that might have had. I mean, there are a number of recommendations in the literature coming forward at the moment, primarily out of the BMA, for addressing moral distress and injury, and these tend to form two very distinct categories. The first is very much going back to these structural solutions. So as I was saying previously, actually to prevent moral distress in an ideal world should be quite easy, because if we can mitigate the risk of moral distress in the UK health and care staff, by ensuring it's well resourced and there aren't staffing issues, etc., etc., then we would have addressed moral distress. I've put an asterisk there because I can't even go into that here really now, because I'm not in a position to be able to make very many inroads into that. That really needs to come, you know, right from government and various NHS organisations. So what I wanted to focus on today, because obviously these are things that we can do for ourselves, the second category tends to be the steps that us as individuals, that staff can take to alleviate the effects of moral distress, which feels a little uncomfortable really, because I suppose on reflection what I'm saying here is we're going to be morally distressed in our current working environment, but let's try and mitigate where we can our own moral injury. So one of the things that's really, really important, and it's what we're doing here today, is talking about moral distress and moral injury. You know, these are, as relatively new terms for health and social care staff. And it is really validating to hear when other people are experiencing similar situations and psychological responses as a result of that. You know, you sort of feel, oh, thank goodness it's not just me. And that can help almost get a sense of lessening the burden. And it means the concept of moral injury and distress will become more mainstream, which really is what we want, because we want it to be so widely recognised that it becomes much, much harder for organisations and supporting structures to not address it in some way. Developing support networks. So again, you know, and it's worth noting that a lot of what relates to steps to manage moral distress also are steps to manage empathy distress, burnout, you know, a whole host of work-related stresses. So support networks should be you know, environments in which we feel we can be supported without fear of judgment. That's what makes those networks beneficial. You know, and examples of these, and I know we certainly have these in VCH, are things like the Schwartz rounds, continuing professional development groups. And again, the sort of structural caveat within this is that we have to, if we want to protect our staff, give them time to participate in such activities, because, you know, I certainly in my experience, and I think Sam would probably agree, that the number of times we attempt to deliver well-being strategies or support environments, people are just too overburdened, too overwhelmed to actually take the time to come. So yeah, there's plenty to address. So if you're offered one and you're allowed the time to go, then that bit of turning up is our responsibility. I wish I had the answers for what to do if you're told you can't go, but we might get to that in Q&A. And one of the things, again, that is specifically with regards to moral distress is if we're left in a situation where we maybe are uncomfortable with decisions or resourcing, sometimes checking in with somebody we work with to just say, you know, oh, this is the best I can do in this situation. What do you think? Again, might give us that sense of we're not alone in this, we're supported, this is the best we can do, we are doing our best given the circumstances. You know, this helps build a much more healthy working culture where, you know, the staff feel more empowered to be able to discuss decisions, and you know, specifically for doctors, particularly if they think that the decision they're making is not optimal for patient care. Unfortunately, the research does suggest that we know it's not always possible to do this. So the BMA has done some research that shows nearly 30% of respondents who had experienced moral distress stated that the fact that their workplace culture did not encourage speaking up was one of the key causes of the distress they were experiencing. So again, you know, it's really hard if we're in situations where we're acting in ways which feel that unethical, yet our recourse, our ability to have this heard and validated and maybe addressed by people in a position to do so can really have that, you know, lead to this significant psychological impact on our health and well-being. And this is why I've put, you know, as I said, as I just went into this bit, ideally, you know, we need organisations to build these cultures into the workplaces before we are expected to take steps ourselves. But I think in the current climate, it would have been remiss of me not to give some personal steps on how to manage moral distress, because, as I say, the chances of that we've probably already experienced it are really quite high. And then seek advice. Again, when making any decisions, check in with an expert in that area or a colleague. And this final point, develop a self-care plan, again goes across burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma. So I think we, as public sector workers, very much come from a place of how can I serve, what can I do for people. So I'm never going to stop reiterating how imperative it is that actually we can't pour from an empty cup. We need to look after ourselves first, and developing a self-care plan means that, you know, we can try to mitigate our risks to some degree of experiencing some of these work-related stress conditions. So, you know, it's been shown that physical and mental fatigue both contribute to moral distress, injury, empathy distress, vicarious trauma, and burnout. And not only might they contribute to that, but actually the impact that they then have on us and the recovery time we need is worsened if we haven't got at least that basic self-care as a foundation for that. So when we talk about vicarious trauma, as I say, a lot of these terms are very interrelated. Vicarious trauma specifically relates to this emotional residue that we're left with from the exposure that we have from hearing stories of trauma and sitting with, witnessing very viscerally sometimes the pain, the fear and the terror that trauma survivors have endured. So, you know, again, I think many of us will have been in situations where we've heard very difficult stories of how people have what has led them into our services. And sometimes, you know, these stories are difficult to put aside once we finish work. So this vicarious trauma very much relates to this state of tension that we're left with, maybe a sense of preoccupation with some of the stories, the trauma experiences that we've heard. You know, it's like waking up at 3 in the morning and finding yourself thinking over and over again about what you've been told, and feeling a lot of the you know the uncomfortable physical and physiological sensations that are associated with what that person may have shared. So this is, again, it's what it's what we experience very, very frequently, particularly, you know, that those of us that might be working in mental health services, but it's almost got to the point where it just becomes part of the role without, you know, that recognition that actually we're not just feeling a bit stressed. There are psychological processes going on that have a real significant impact. And then again, another very closely associated experience is what's referred to as compassion fatigue. So Figley in 1982 described the cost of caring for others, and defined compassion fatigue specifically as a state experienced by those helping people or animals in distress. It's an extreme state of tension and preoccupation with the suffering of those being helped to the degree that it can almost create a secondary traumatic stress for the helper. So you can see there how very closely the definitions of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma fuse. So on the next slide, I've actually called it empathy distress, because that compassion fatigue definition was, you know, quite a number of decades ago now. And what the emerging evidence is showing via the use of things like MRI is that actually it's not the compassion that fatigues during this process. Certainly as defined in the brain anyway, it is that the distress associated with empathy increases. So increasingly referring to compassion fatigue as empathy distress fatigue because of the emerging evidence, but also there's been for quite a while now a recognition that compassion fatigue feels quite an unhelpful narrative. So personally speaking, I've certainly experienced empathy distress, but I've never kind of felt that I don't have compassion for the people that I work with. And so I think certainly in the caring professions, empathy distress is much more frequently used now. One of the things that differentiates empathy distress perhaps from things like burnout or moral distress, which require, you know, quite an ongoing exposure, is empathy distress can have a very sudden onset. And ironically, those individuals who are most empathetic have been found to be most at risk of experiencing empathy distress. But I suppose logically that makes sense, really, because if you're really empathizing with the you know, the stories that you're hearing, then you're going to be more sort of akin to knowing or sensing what they may have been through and be distressed by it. So the final part of the webinar, really, I want to look at identifying distress, because as I say, although all of these definitions have got distinct facets to them, the overarching theme is there's a lot of work-related stress and distress. So I want to talk a bit about how to identify that and then finish with what to do about it. So self-reflection is a really, really helpful way to notice early signs of distress. And sometimes it's quite difficult when we're in the thick of things to just think I'm going to have a bit of time out to self-reflect. So keeping a journal or simply jotting down challenges at the end of a work week can highlight changes in how we're feeling towards our work. So, you know, and it means that we've got something to refer back to. So, you know, if sometimes we may find ourselves thinking, is it really worse than it was 6 months ago? And actually, if we've jotted down a few things at the end of each week, we may get a sense that, oh, actually, do you know what? Maybe I am starting to experience more distress now. Another really helpful way to identify stress is that we're likely to observe that in our colleagues. So what we call this soft intelligence within these very close-knit working environments, particularly when you think about, you know, working on wards or in community teams, social care offices, you know, we get to know our colleagues very well. And it can be really, really helpful, you know, just a gentle inquiry into, oh, you don't seem yourself today, you know, how are you doing? That then might lead on to self-reflection. So, you know, we need to be looking out for ourselves, and we need to be looking out for those we're working with too. And from a more senior leader perspective, there are multiple assessment tools that we are able to utilize to get a sense of how the people we're working with and ourselves are doing. So these are things like the professional quality of life scale. There's numerous burnout scales, you know, which can be effectively used and reused to identify and monitor risk of distress and its impact. And again, personal reflective debrief after an adverse event. So, you know, if you experience something at work, we tend to know if we feel it's been an adverse event. That might be a useful trigger for us to go and have some a reflective debrief. But then the other thing that really benefits in that situation is having a team discussion, a team debrief regarding the event. But again, the key there needs to be in this blame-free environment, you know, because that's one of the processes that enables it to build resilience. So the other thing, and although this might sound counterproductive, to manage distress is write down 3 good things that have happened at work. And this can be in a day or a week. But again, what it can do, you know, we do have, the brain has a negativity bias. And what is really, really helpful about keeping any kind of gratitude journal or note is that it can help bring back into focus things that are working well, things that we are doing well, you know. So maybe getting into the habit of doing that has shown to be helpful for people. Identifying what you need to do to recharge and refuel before your warning light comes on. So thinking a bit, you know, the metaphor as a fuel tank, you know, when we're on empty, well, we have to refuel before we can carry on. So again, identifying maybe in a self-care plan, how will you know when you need to up your self-care? What will you see? What will you feel in yourself? And while you are recharging, avoid taking on new commitments. We wouldn't try to drive the vehicle off while we were still putting the fuel in. You know, it's and this certainly rings true with individuals that I know, probably myself, that people in caring professions have a habit of saying yes. We find it so hard to say no, even when we could actually say no, because, you know, there's always going to be circumstances in which we can't say no. If we have like a patient, for example, that comes into a ward, you can't go no. However, I think there are certainly for most of us times when even when we can say no, we say yes because we feel we should. Setting boundaries between work and home is really important. Pretty much any of the webinars that you listen to that I give, I am a huge advocate on, you know, separating out the two. And really, if you can, make a conscious effort to leave work at work and only re-engage when you return to work. I'm certainly not a technophobe. I love technology. It's creating a whole host of opportunities, but it's also absolutely blurring our work home boundaries. The number of people I know that might be working at base and then finish and now still go home and check their emails, where we wouldn't have done that prior to COVID, or certainly not as frequently. I think the other thing we all really need to acknowledge is how difficult our job actually is. You know, I mean, I don't go into great detail with family and friends about what I do, but people, I know a lot of people, they say to me, I couldn't do what you do. And I think we lose a lot of how difficult our job is when it starts to feel normal, because what makes our job difficult is much of what we do really is difficult. And if we get to the point where it's just another task on a list, then we perhaps should reevaluate. So it's being kind to ourselves and acknowledging that we're doing a really tough job and it is hard. That being said, it shouldn't make us physically and mentally unwell. Colleague support groups are increasingly popular, and again, you know, these have been found to be really great forums to share feelings, and that then leads on to like a reduction of stress, and it reduces isolation, which is a common consequence of burnout and a common consequence of post-COVID working environments for some individuals. Another suggestion as well is socialise outside of your professional group, as this can help provide fresh perspectives, stimulate new ideas, help discover previously undiscovered resources. And again, you know, some of the really close-knit tight teams that we have, and we value, you know, those friendships and those colleagues incredibly so, sometimes do lead us to maybe not look outside of the immediate group of individuals for support. So, you know, don't be afraid to ask for help. And if you look inwards and realise that you're not the same energetic, caring person you used to be, might be time to reflect on why you wanted to work in the role in the first place, to see whether that might re-stimulate, re-energise. But I think it's worth acknowledging that we don't have the power to cure everyone or meet everybody's needs from social care perspectives. So if we can focus on what we can control, such as our ability to deliver care and compassion, and if we reinforce and recognise our effort, not always the outcome, because, you know, I worked again in a dementia service for many years, and outcomes are not always great in some services for very obvious reasons. And another suggestion perhaps is listing the situations that cause you to feel most distressed, and then next to each item maybe write down at least just one way to modify the situation to reduce the stress. And if nothing else, hopefully that will help you think a little more creatively about what you can do. And remembering that distress weakens our mind and our body, and we do need space to recover. Take all the breaks you are entitled to during the day. Eating and drinking is incredibly important, and evidence shows that regular breaks actually enhance performance. Take all your annual leave, adhere to it, turn your phone off, don't check your emails, don't mute. If you've got these WhatsApp work groups, mute it while you're on leave. You don't want to be reminded of what's going on. Try and maintain a life outside of work. You know, this is it. This is our life. and acknowledge that you can still do all of those fabulous suggestions and it still might not be enough, because we are working in unprecedented, challenging times. And if you need professional support, please seek it, because it's all right not to be all right.